Anne Elisabeth Moutet. She's the France columnist for the Telegraph. Great to have you on the programme. Does the real problem go away by tearing down a controversial statue or a street name?
No, I think there have been various solutions brought up in France about this, especially since, as everywhere else right now in the Western world and elsewhere, we have demands that statues be torn down and the streets be renamed. And now the solution in cities like Bordeaux, which benefited from the slave trade, is whenever a street name is of a controversial figure, there is a plaque explaining what good things that person did and what bad things that person did, and that's explanatory. And some anti-racist leaders have said that it's much better to remember history rather than to try to forget it and erase it, because how can you learn otherwise? On the other hand, you have people who want to tear down statues because it gives them momentum. And right now there are demands in France that Colbert, the great finance minister of Louis XIV, the Sun King, his statue should disappear, his name should be taken off from French schools, because among many things he did for the French economy and French power, he also legislated he provided a framework for the status of black slaves in French colonies in the West Indies. And right now the debate is going on, but it seems very obvious that it's much better to remind people of what the Code Noir, the Black Code, was about, what laws were written by our countries. France was not alone in that respect, than to forget everything and have a tabula rasa. That sounds more, it's more like the Taliban, what they did when they tore down Buddhas in Afghanistan.
And do you really think that the history of slavery, that is so sensitive and so important, is forgotten by taking down statues?
I think it's very important to remember it. It's also important to remember it within a context. Like many horrible things that have disappeared, thank God, from our world, mostly. There still is slavery in pockets of our world today. But I think it's important to know what happened. The Roman Empire had slaves. Socrates had slaves in ancient Greece. The Russians only abolished slavery in 1860. There have been slaves in Mauritania until recently. It's supposed to be abolished, but there still are slaves right now. There were slaves markets. You know very well that in the Ottoman Empire there was slavery. All of this is something that belongs to history, like, torture and interrogations, at least in civilized countries, and many other things, and we ought to be aware of it. It's part of what happened. We should certainly remember it. We should know, we should teach it, but it's not the only defining thing. It is part of something. People can be good, bad, and in between, and it makes up human nature. And what is important is the trajectory, rather than spotlighting various areas and saying this is unspeakable using the vision of the present.
And do you think it's a time to look at, you mentioned what's happening in France, we're seeing so actively what's happening in the UK and the US, for maybe a review of historical personalities in Europe? We saw recently Franco's remains being removed in Spain.
I think the problem is right now there is this sort of fashion, to use a difficult word. It's right now you've got mobs and you've got irritation, and some of it is pain that is very understandable on the George Floyd murder and on race relations in America, which are different from race relations in other places. And I think having a cookie-cutter solution and taking decisions in the heat of the moment is probably the worst possible thing. I don't think it should be put under the carpet. But I certainly think that there are people right now in France that want to apply American solutions to the French system. It doesn't work for us. This is not who we are. And the French, I like to remind people that when Washington was still segregated, the president of the French Senate, the number 2 person in the state, was a black man between 1948 and 1947 and 1968. So we have a different way of approaching things. We're not blameless by a long chalk, but it's more a matter for history than a matter for public announcements in the heat of the moment. I think all it does is make it so difficult for the people who ought to learn about it to want to learn about it, which is essential, and it creates division when we should reunite in what our nations have become.
And do you think the far right, as we're seeing in the UK, could take advantage of the situation?
It's I don't know whether they're trying to take advantage, but certainly they will, because you can't beat up people and expect that they will follow you gladly. And at the same time, that you have to have adhesion of the people who listen to you in order to make things change. And the last way is to tell people, you're all guilty, kneel in front of us because we're guilty. I don't think a 7-year-old girl who's carrying a placard that her parents presumably gave her saying, I'm guilty, I have white privilege, is the solution for that sort of pain. And I think also it's very, not to make a pun, I think it's very childish. I think what really matters is more understanding, first of all, of the pain today that caused people to look back in the reasons for those situations to exist, and then work at it. I'm not saying we should forget it. I'm a historian by trade. I think history is very important. But right now, it's anger, it's division, and you have a small minority of extremists who are driving the debate, and that's the last thing we want from either extreme.
Anne Elisabeth Moutet in Paris, France's columnist for the Telegraph, thank you very much indeed.